So the genesis of my students, people that come from my tree, is that you will, to the best of my ability, understand how muscles influence motion, skeletal muscles. Well above and beyond other students from other universities, and way, 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 way beyond people who practice this stuff without having formal education. It's not their fault, but once again, you don't practice law without a law degree, but people practice fitness and coaching all the time without formal education. Okay? So what we have to do is we have to recognize that that's an issue in our field, and I need to teach you guys how muscles really influence motion without the layman's terms and the fast and loose, and the biggest common mistake is associating specific muscles with specific movements or motions. And I know I keep repeating myself, that's how important this is, and that's how much people still miss what I'm trying to tell you. It's silly after a while, but it's just, people keep missing it. Okay? So what I have up here is just a quick summary that all you have to do is apply this concept and rinse, wash, and repeat. Now, the concept is simple. The application could be infinite. There's infinitely many ways you can have movements and external forces and exercises and people. But the concept is really simple, and that is agonistic muscles. Okay? These are muscles that are working above rest to do a job of influencing motion. Okay? I'll repeat myself. These are muscles working above rest to do a job of influencing motion. Jobs have secondary functions like stabilization of joints. That's not what I'm talking about right now. So in other words, if you grab some heavy dumbbells and you feel your biceps and your triceps puffing up, even though you're not trying to do anything, it's because they're literally trying to prevent your shoulder from falling out of socket with the traction that's happening with those dumbbells. Okay? That's for another day in time. Specifically for this class, we're looking at how agonistic muscles influence motion. And I put, hey, motion is going to be our displacement in our work equation through contraction types, concentric, eccentric, and isometric. And if you say, well, isometric, there is no displacement. Mechanically, no. But physiologically, yes. That was Friday's lecture. Okay? Zero is still a number, guys. So like even though you know, there's no mechanical work, zero is still an output. It's still a number. That's the way you want to look at it. Okay? So let's do our first example, and we're going to do a ton of application from Friday's lecture on this. The first step that I teach my students to figure out who's working and how they're working, and let's also realize why this is so important, guys. You're gonna to be a true practitioner of the human body in terms of movement, human movement studies. We have to know what muscles are influencing specific motions. And in your own individual fields, whether it's personal training, athletic training, any kind of therapy, that's really important because sometimes you need to work specific muscles with specific contractions. Okay? So the first thing that I teach you to identify is try to figure out, not the contraction, try to figure out who's working. Try to figure out the agonists. Try to figure out which group of muscles are working above rest and tone. Your instinct is going to want to say, well, that's the bicep. And I'm going to say, well, you're not wrong, but it could be more right. What about brachialis? What about the brachioradialis? What about the pronator teres? There's other muscles here besides just one that always gets the credit for everything. Okay? So in other words, to be still correct, in other words, the bicep is part of this team, part of this group of muscles. that pull in the direction of elbow flexion, we're going to say, well, the dumbbell is trying to extend him. True? The dumbbell's trying to cause extension. And you could do this a number of ways. You could do a thought experiment. If he turned off all the muscles in his elbow, this would happen. And then you could say, well, I definitely don't want the tricep and the extension pullers, because that would be two forces pulling in the same direction. That would be like saying you have a tug of war with two different forces pulling in two different directions. Imagine this force dropped their rope, came over to this side, and both forces pulled this way with nothing pulling on the other end. The rope would fly across the room. Yes? That's what would happen if you turned on your extension pullers with gravity trying to extend. You'd slam the dumbbell into the padding. Sometimes that works because you can kind of see who you don't need. It's like process of elimination. And if you can see who you don't need, then maybe that will elicit or reveal the muscle group that you do need. The elbow flexion pullers, or as we're going to call that group in class, the elbow flexors. Who are those muscles? Who cares right now? You just have to understand, you have to visualize that we have groups or teams of muscles in every direction of motion. And the elbow flexes and extends. So to influence motion in our puppets, we're going to have flexion pullers and extension pullers. And we're going to have to be able to see when we need those different agonists for different things.
So I understand why you would need flexors in this case.
Mm-hmm.
My immediate thought was bicep flexors, but I know that the bicep can't necessarily flex, so is it more that you like?
What do you mean the bicep can't flex?
Well, are you, whenever we're doing, like, naming, I guess, the agonists, or the motion, are we doing it by a joint instead of a muscle?
Were you here? Did you watch the previous videos? I'm not putting you on the spot. It would just really help because I went through all the time for all that.
I was here on Friday. But
So let's put a pin in that. I'm going to answer your question, but it still may not make sense. So my suggestion is go back and watch those videos because I could literally spend the rest of class trying to answer that question. That would be saying the bicep flexors is like saying the Brian Campbell kinesiology department. I'm part of the kinesiology department. We don't have to be redundant. The bicep is part of the group that are the flexors, the flexion pullers. So we don't have to be redundant. It's just the bicep is the only thing people ever say because bless their hearts, and you know what I mean in Southern talk, that's all anybody knows. And so there's other muscles besides the bicep. So to say the bicep flexors is still defeating the purpose of me trying to teach you guys that there's other things involved. So we're going to just say the elbow flexors, and yes, the bicep is part of that group, but we don't have to be redundant. We don't have to say the bicep and the flexors, because the bicep's already there. You're very welcome. And that goes to anybody else. If some of this verbiage is kind of weird, just go back and watch some of those videos, and that'll help. Again, a lot of it's not your fault. It's just how this stuff has been told to you through your life, and you just kind of play fast and loose with it. This is more of a therapy session than education. It's true. I'm trying to retrain your brain to see things for the way they are, so that my students don't do things like the core and the quads and the glutes and the hams and the delts and the pecs. Okay. All right. Contraction will be proven. We solve for contraction. We solve for work. So the first thing we need to identify is our agonistic group, because we can see why we solve the agonist, or we prove we identify, I think that's a better word, identify the agonist. And so if you're writing down, if you're making notes, you say, okay, in this exercise, my agonist are my elbow flexion pullers. We call our elbow flexors, and the bicep is one of those muscles. No problem with that. But there's others. So for this exercise, we're identifying our agonist, the group of muscles working above resting tone that do a job of influencing motion as our elbow flexors. Now what we're going to do is utilize what we've been studying for 2 months now, and that's our hopefully confident understanding of identifying motion itself, and that's the displacement. Seeing the motion is going to be observed. So we identify agonists, we observe motion, and based off of those two variables, we can solve for contraction. If he's just holding this position, we're going to observe no displacement or movement, but we still have gravity trying to do something in his elbow. We still have muscles trying to prevent something from happening in his elbow. So it's not like there's no physiological work going on. There's only so much hot water from that analogy that he could pour before he's going to run out. So if there's no displacement, but that muscle and his buddies are still doing a job, that is proven to be isometric contraction or isometric work. Why do I not like, why do I tend to use work more than contraction? Because contraction infers shortening, just the word contraction. So isometric contraction kind of sounds like a conflict of interest. It kind of sounds like it's weird. Well, how can you have something that's shortening, but yet it's not? And the key is trying to shorten. It's trying to shorten, like a rubber band. If I stretch it out, it's trying to shorten. It's trying to contract. I'm just not letting it. So work and contraction in this class is going to be interchangeable. It's just that contraction infers shortening, and it's tough for sometimes students to get that conflict of interest with isometrics and eccentric. It's even weirder to think of something that's being lengthened and shortening at the same time. And the answer is it's not. It's being lengthened and it's trying to shorten. Big, big, big semantics, but very important. All right, let's play hypothetical. From this position, you observe. Agonist doesn't change in this exercise, regardless of his motion, because gravity is not changing what it's trying to do. So the agonist is going to be the same. But from this position, you observe elbow extension. That's a movement that you would have observed, just like on our first 3 exams. So that's where I'm hoping you can see this sentence form start to form. It's a sentence, it's a statement, it's an equation, it's a proof. The elbow flexion pullers are going to be responsible for elbow extension, but only through the context of eccentric contraction. Elbow flexion pullers, which the bicep is one of them, but not the only one, is going to be responsible for that extension, but only through the context of eccentric contraction. That's the only way that can happen, because the bicep and his buddies can't push your elbow into extension. Yes? Good. From here, if you observe flexion, elbow flexion pullers, we call them elbow flexors, are going to be responsible for elbow flexion, but only through the context of concentric muscle contraction. Concentric work. Flexors, when they're doing a job, do flexion through concentrics, shortening while trying to shorten. Actually doing what they're trying to do. It's like concentric is like if we're playing a doubleheader in baseball, and in the first game you win while trying to win, and in the next game you lose while trying to win. The first game would be an analogy of concentric victory. You did what you were trying to do. And the other would be an eccentric. You lost while you were still trying to win. A better example, though, would be if you were playing and like a college team was playing like a little league team, and the college team could absolutely dominate that team, but they're gonna let the kids play with them. They're gonna let them, oh, you struck me out, ha ha, and they're gonna get out, right? You're gonna let them win because you want to send them home happy because you want them to come to camp again next year. So you're still playing the game, but you're letting the external force, you're letting the other team be greater. Does that make sense? You're still controlling it, because at any time you could turn it on and crank one 450 feet on those little kids and make them cry. I guess in basketball it's the same thing, right? When y'all having the summer camps. And I mean, you could just be swatting little kid shots left and right. But you want to make them happy. So you go for the little pump fake. You let them go around you and they score and they're like, eh. Oh my God, I just want to swat this kid. Crowd. So we have to understand, guys, that the bicep and his buddies, the elbow flexion pullers, are responsible for movement in both directions. But that responsibility lies in two different types of contractions. One in which they're shortening while trying to shorten, and the other, they're being lengthened while still trying to shorten. It's the difference between taking a newborn baby and making them come off of the crib, or letting them back down nice and easy. You're still going to use the same muscles. The same muscle of the elevator makes you go up, keeps you from falling down, and lets you go down at a nice, easy speed. All of those different motions were influenced by the same exact type of pull. That cable didn't push you down. It let you go down. Okay? Any questions before we do another example? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so even though we can identify what the Agnes is, if we can't visualize the motion, we can't assume, so that'll make it isometric.
Well, the context. So if there's always going to be context in the question. So remember in exam, and by remember, I don't mean that, I'm saying in general. Exam 1, there's two different ways we can infer motion. One is a picture and say, you observe, or two anatomical, four anatomical. So on the test, I'm going to give you that context. I'm going to say, he holds this position for 10 seconds. Or I'll say, from this position, you observe extension. From this position, you observe flexion. From this position, he goes to anatomical. Or I'll give you a before and after. But there has to be context. Absolutely. I'm never just going to give you a blank picture and not ask you specific questions. Good question. All right, let's try another one. This is one that I had some biomechanics students mess up on. So let's start now. Yoink. Awesome. Perfect. That's exactly the one I was hoping. Let's hope it's not a web tutorial. Yay! Yoink. All right, here we go. What's one of our, I'm about to turn it on. I just don't want y'all to start too early. In exam 1, I tried to hammer home, we don't assume, we don't assume, we don't assume, we don't assume, we don't assume. And it gets, the message can sometimes get diluted. Don't assume. All right, let's try this one. First, let's identify the agonist in this exercise. paddings on machines push or pull us? Good to know. From this position, you observe knee extension. Now, ladies and gentlemen and young professionals, on the exam, when I give you an exercise, every exercise is going to be slow and controlled. That doesn't mean in life you got to do everything slow and controlled. But there's zero reason to go into any machine and just start letting things bang around, all right? In fact, one of the good things about slow and controlled is for your range of motion, as long as you maintain a constant speed, you're actually doing the weight that you're trying to do. It's only when you speed up and slow down that you got to do a little more, a little less, within that amount of time. So for all of these exercises, there's no reason to say, oh, I thought he was going to make the legs swing up as fast as he can. I mean, not in an exercise, okay? Slow and controlled. Slow and controlled, slow and controlled. The last part of this class will get into the exceptions. Sprinters don't want to go slow and controlled. Or, if you're doing a functional task, I don't want to go slow and controlled to kill a mosquito on my thumb. Right? So there are exceptions where you got to go faster than what gravity can offer you. But those are rare, and that's why they're exceptions. You observe knee extension. What type of contraction would that be? I'm going to just cut straight to the proof. What type of contraction would that be? Of whatever the agonist is. Eccentric, good. How did we get there? Well, first we're going to identify the agonist. What is this machine trying to do to his knees? Extend. We got to speak in terms of motion. Okay? Well, I don't mind if you say push him up, push him down, I don't know, the cheer, push, 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 whatever. We have to bring it back to joint motion so that we can then take the leap of agonistic muscle pull influence. The padding's trying to extend his knees. Yes? So what he doesn't need are muscles that are also trying to extend his knees. If he used his quad and company, the knee extension pullers, he would literally pull his feet away from the padding. Does that make sense? So he needs flexion pulling muscles. Well, Campbell, why don't you just say hamstrings? This is why I don't just say hamstrings. What are the hamstrings? Semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, both heads, long and short in this exercise, but also the gastrocnemius, the popliteus, the sartorius, the gracilis. There's other muscles there. There's 8 muscles that are knee flexors. So if all you do is say hamstrings, one, do you even know what that really means? And two, we lose track of other muscles that function there. And it's very likely one of those muscles is going to need to be rehabbed, it's going to need to be stretched, it's going to need to be worked. We need knee flexion pullers. Oh, the hamstrings are in that group. They're on that team. But they're part of a team. Yes? Does anybody have a problem seeing why we need knee flexion pullers in this exercise? Now, whether we observe flexion or extension, the machine's trying to extend you the whole time. True? Yeah. So we're going to need our knee flexors the whole time. Same external force, same agonistic group. So the variations in the movements that we observe isn't from different muscles. The changes in movement is going to be changes of contraction of those same muscles. When we observe knee extension in this exercise, the knee flexors are going to be working eccentric. And when we observe knee flexion in this exercise, those knee flexors are going to be working concentric. So in the case of the extension, knee flexors in this exercise are going to be responsible for the extension through the context of eccentric contraction. A plus B is equal to C. Agonist in joint motions is contraction. Force and displacement is work. Not every exercise is going to start off with concentric contraction. Watch, here's another exercise that's doing the same thing. Now what's cool is in biomechanics, we're going to learn why different positions can emphasize certain muscles within the group based on length tension changes of muscles that are biarticular, that cross multiple joints. It's going to be some cool stuff. But this exercise is working the same agonistic group. So that's why we can't assume. In the seated position, the assumption is, oh, this exercise works quads. And you don't have to admit it, but I know some of you thought it. Because it's natural. You say, oh, when I get into this machine, I'm working my quads. But we can't assume. In this exercise, it's actually trying to extend you. When you're doing your quads, that padding is trying to flex you. That make sense? They always look so happy doing this stuff. All right, let's try one where let's go back to one of our first classes. Yoink. I try to find before and after. Yoink. We analyze motion joint by joint. We analyze agonistic muscles joint by joint. So let's do a left hip analysis. Let's do a left hip analysis from A to B and then from B to A. Things that I would like for you to identify. Agonistic muscles involved, agonistic group, and the contraction that goes with the different movements that you observe. In other words, in the game of Clue, who did it? How did they do it? Where they did it, I just answered, in the hip. So in the game of Clue, you had to figure out who was the killer, where did they do it, how did they do it. I'm telling you where, left hip. So now you got to let me know who did it and how did they do it. A to B, B to A. Always feel free to engage in conversation with your neighbors. What we're also going to work on is different ways that I can ask questions about content. That's another thing that we're working on. question number 1. Change in position. So that would be A to B or B to A. Where would concentric contraction be found in the left hip? From A to B or B to A? B to A. Good. And again, this is what I'm trying to empower you guys with. There's no longer guessing games. Like this is what I love about physics. There's no exceptions to physics. 2 + 2 is equal to 4. And that's how simple this can be. It has to be concentric contraction. That dumbbell or that kettlebell is trying to flex you. True? Or another way to look at it is trying to keep you flexed. It's not trying to extend you. So if you're going to make the hip extend against something that's trying to flex you, it has to be through concentric contraction. You have to make yourself come up. You have to shorten while trying to shorten. So it would be the left hip extensors making the left hip extension happen through concentric contraction from B to A. Yes? From A to B, kettlebell is still trying to flex you along with all the stuff you have in front of your hip. So your hip extensors need to be in agonist. You don't need your flexion pullers. You already got something trying to flex you. If you use your flexion pullers, you literally throw yourself into the ground. And there's some students who would swear that's what has to happen. Because they don't understand. Because they don't put in the work to understand. Because it's just comforting to know what you learned through Kellogg's Cornflake certification. But what I'm trying to do is empower you by being able to see and prove and explain and know what's happening here. I'm trying to give you your money's worth for your college education. Something that you'll never forget. You're going to have forever. Left hip extensors working eccentrically from A to B. So that was the initial movement, right? So not every initial movement has to be concentric. Squats going down isn't concentric. The first initial movement. Bench press, if you're doing the bar, you take it off, the first initial movement is going to be eccentric. So we can't always play those assumption games. Okay? I had a professor here when I was in school 20 plus years ago named Dr. Manier. He taught motor something. And for our final, he made us memorize 15 random words in kinesiology. Just to practice memorizing. And he had one question on it. I was mad. Balance, tactile, laterality, auditory, aerobic, overloading, flexibility, KR, self-esteem, gender, kinesthetic, visual, anaerobic, atrophy, and grouping were the words. And my point in telling you this is some of the best teachers I ever had were some of the worst teachers I've ever had. Because I learned a lesson that day. I will never ask my students to uselessly memorize anything. Everything will have a purpose. Everything will have a goal, a reason, and everything will have usefulness that you guys will carry on for the rest of your lives. That's the intent. All right, time for y'all to play along. Somebody give me an exercise, and I'm going to pull it up like we did last time. It could be anything, anywhere. Well, let's not get crazy. We'll get to the crazy ones.
What was the right hip for that exercise? Or were we just doing the
No, what a great question. The right hip would be working isometrically throughout the entire exercise, right? Mm-hmm. Working physiologically to maintain that position. Creating rigid links, guys, is very useful. You know, if you're trying to move things, it's a lot easier to move a rigid block than a sack of rice or moving potatoes, as my mom used to say. When the mass constantly shifts and moves, it's harder to influence that motion. Okay? So, so your left hip is going to be, your right hip is going to work isometrically, but it's mostly just to create rigidity so that your left hip is actually going to be responsible for the motion, for you going down and you coming up. You know what it's like? It's like, and this is actually why we do it, the right hip is going to have nothing to do with that pelvic girdle rotation, because it's up in the air, but the left hip will. The left hip is going to allow the anterior through the hip flexion, and the left hip is going to force the posterior through the hip extension. Good question. Yeah, we could play around with a lot of stuff. What about the muscles at his left knee to maintain this position? Meaning to prevent him from collapsing down. Flexors or extensors? Extensors, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, Campbell, why don't you just say quad? We can, but we lose what it's actually doing. We lose the magic of what the quad is doing. And that is in this exercise, in this position, being an extension pulling influence to go against the flexion influence that's trying to make it buckle. Seeing the external influences, it's a lot easier to see the internal muscle influences if we talk about them also influencing joint motion. Ground and gravity is trying to flex your knee, so I need muscles that are trying to extend my knee to go against it. None of that yields itself. None of that shows itself. None of that presents itself if we just say quad. None of it. All right, who wants to give me an exercise? We'll see if we can figure it out. What you got? Awesome. Let's try to find a good before and after. You know, I'm trying to avoid the ones with the muscles, so I'm trying to see if we can practice seeing it and not have it given away. Okay, guys, unless otherwise told, we're always going to start, well, I say always, but we'll do left to right. So the left position is our start, the right position is our finish. We analyze motion joint by joint, we analyze muscles joint by joint. So we're not going to have a full body conversation. We have to pick a joint and just analyze it by that, and then we can move on to another joint. So things we can talk about. We can talk about elbows, we can talk about shoulders, we can talk about scapula. Let's do shoulders. Now the shoulders are moving in kind of a combinational thing, or combinational planes. You know, we talk about how frontal, sagittal, but you can go in a combination, north and east and south and west. So how do we differentiate which ones we want by plane? So the majority of this motion, let's say we're looking at frontal. So we're looking at either abduction pullers or adduction pullers. Okay? For this conversation, abduction pullers or adduction pullers. So the kind of questions you're going to have to answer on the test, what group of muscles do I need in this exercise? And you solve that by understanding what the machine or the exercise is trying to do to you, the external forces. And then you're going to have to make the leap of understanding how the same muscles in any exercise are going to influence two different motions through two different contraction types. Agonistic muscles influence motion through contraction. Rinse, wash, repeat. So the machine is trying to abduct the person. So he would need adduction pullers. And if you say, well, why don't you just say lats? I'm not saying they're not, but they have help. There's other muscles there. And lat itself doesn't tell us how it's pulling. But understanding that a machine is trying to ab, but you have muscles that are trying to add, helps us to visualize what's actually happening in that joint. The tug of war that's happening between external and internal. Left to right, concentric or eccentric? Concentric. And we can prove it. Because if my adductors are working, doing a job, and I actually observe the motion that they're pulling in, that has to be the concentric contraction. Right to left is going to be my eccentric, because my adduction pullers are going to be responsible for abduction, movement in the opposite direction of their pull, but only through the context of eccentric contraction.
Will you specify on the test like what joint?
I have to. Yeah. The only way I don't have to is if it's like just a single thing, like if it's.
Okay.
But even the answers will be in, even the specific specificity will be in the answer choices. So if I'm just asking you an elbow exercise, it may say elbow flexors, concentric elbow exercise. So even that will be inferred. But yeah, if there's multiple things happening, I gotta tell you what specifically they're asking about. Yep. What about scapula? Would I need upward rotators or downward rotators in this exercise? Downward rotators. Now let me give you another common mistake. Another common mistake, and it goes back to we don't associate muscles with motion, specific muscles with specific motion. There's going to be students on this test. I'm not saying it's any of you guys. I hope it's none of you guys. I'm going to say, okay guys, what muscles of the scapula are working this exercise? From left to right, and then from right to left. And I swear, as 8-pound, 7-ounce baby Christmas Jesus is my witness, I'm going to have some students that are going to say, downward rotators, and then upward rotators. It's going to happen. They're going to say downward rotator muscles from left to right, and then upward rotator muscles from right to left. And it's the same reason why my friend said chest on the way up and back on the way down. Yes? You get it? And am I saying that to scare you? Heck yeah, I want to scare you. I want to scare you and get the right answers. Not literally, metaphorically. I just want you to be aware. Okay? Going back to the first example that we did. This is going to happen too. I'm going to have students tell me that they're working hamstrings during the flexion and that they're working quads for the extension. It's going to happen. And that makes me sad. Yummy tears. Does everybody understand where I'm preaching from here? Like I'm literally playing cards. I'm playing poker with my cards out. I'm showing you my hand. I'm telling you what I'm going to ask. And not only that, I'm telling you why people commonly miss it. The machine is trying to extend you the whole time. So you're going to need flexors the whole time. At any point, if you did use your extension pullers or your quads, you'd literally pull your feet away from the pad. There's no reason to use those muscles in this exercise. Last chance for questions or clarifications. Guys, please go back and watch those first lectures where we talk about verbiage. Verbiage, 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 so important. Have a good one.